Hello students, this is Dr. Dakshayani, Assistant Professor from Department of Zoology, Maharani's Science College for Women, Bengaluru. Well students, in the previous sessions we had learnt about the general characteristic features of amphibians and classification of living amphibians up to orders with examples, and we also learned about the origin of amphibians, the transition from water to land. Students, in this session let us learn in detail about the bones of skull and lower jaw in frog osteology under paper 3 chordata. The objectives of learning today's topic is to identify and understand the bones of skull and lower jaw, that is mandible of frog, and also to distinguish the bones present on both dorsal and ventral side of skull of frog, and also to develop the skill of drawing and labeling the diagrams of skull and lower jaw of frog. The contents as follows: introduction to the endoskeleton and the contents of skull and lower jaw, that is mandible of frog. Endoskeleton: the skeleton that supports the internal body organs as well as the soft parts of body is called as endoskeleton, where it is mainly made up of the combination of bones and cartilage, and these structures are joined with one another to form the internal framework. The major functions of endoskeletal system in the body are: it provides the proper shape to the body as well as it supports to the body. It enables the body movement. It also protects the internal body organs. It helps in the production of blood cells from the soft tissues which are present in the bone marrow. It also stores certain minerals such as calcium, phosphorus, and they are provided until they are needed by the body. Coming to the endoskeleton of frog. As we all know that frog is specialized for jumping and swimming movement, because of which the vertebral column has lost its flexibility, and together with the enlarged pelvic girdle, the endoskeleton has become rigid for transmitting the force from hind limbs to body. The endoskeleton in frog is partly made up of cartilage and partly it is made up of bones, where in the development of larval stages the entire endoskeleton is made up of cartilage, hence it is cartilaginous in nature, whereas in the adult it is completely replaced by bones. And in certain areas where the bones are developed from the dermis or the skin, where there is no history of pre-existence of cartilage, and such bones are called as membrane bones. And certain areas of the endoskeleton parts, it has been calcified, that means it is impregnated by the calcium salts, hence such bones are called as calcified cartilage. The endoskeleton is conveniently divided into the axial skeleton and the appendicular skeleton. The axial skeleton includes the skull, mandible, vertebral column and sternum, which lie along the median longitudinal axis of the body. Whereas the appendicular skeleton includes the girdles and the limbs. The axial skeleton, as I told you, it includes the skull and lower jaw or the mandible. Coming to the skull of frog, it possesses certain characteristic features to identify the skull as the frog skull. And the features are: the skull of frog is broad, large, triangular in shape, and it is dorso-ventrally flattened, where the cranium of the skull is completely made up of cartilage. Hence, the cranium in the frog of skull is called as chondrocranium. It is small and narrow. It's because it possesses only a small brain. The occipital region in the skull is reduced, and the skull is said to be dicondylic, where the skull possesses the two occipital condyles for the articulation with the first vertebra of the body or the vertebral column called atlas. And the skull of frog is also known as plastibasic. It is because the skull, the posterior end of the skull is broader, and it is mainly occupied by the large eye orbits. As a result, the cranium part, the mid-dorsal part of the cranium is highly reduced, and such condition of a skull is called as platybasic. In skull of frog, the supra or the basi-occipital bones are completely absent. The omer bones bears the omerine teeth, and the jaws are said to be autostylic because the jaw suspension is free. Hence, it is called as autostylic jaws in frog skull. The skull includes the three main parts. They are called as the cranium, the sense capsules, and the visceral skeleton, that is nothing but the upper and lower jaws. The cranium. The cranium consists of the occipital segment. This is the occipital segment on dorsal side of the posterior end. On ventral side, it has the parasphenoid segment at posterior end of the cranium, and at the anterior end of the cranium it has the spine ethmoid. This is the spine ethmoid region dorsally, and it also has the frontoparietal region at mid dorsal region of the cranium. The occipital segment of the cranium. Before I explain the occipital segment, the cranium is nothing but the brain box which encloses the brain, and it is completely cartilaginous in nature. Hence, the cranium in the frog is called as chondrocranium. This cranium, as I've told you, it consists of the occipital segment, the ethmoid segment, frontoparietal segment, and parasphenoid segment. The occipital segment. When you take the occipital segment as a loose bone, this looks like this. This is the occipital segment of the cranium. It is the posterior most part of the cranium, where it encloses a large hole called foramen magnum. So this is the foramen magnum, from which the spinal cord emerges out from the cranium. There are two irregular cartilaginous bones called occipitals, which lie on each side of the foramen and completely surrounds it. The ex-occipital bears a oval convexities on their posterior surfaces called occipital condyles. These are the occipital condyles which are present on posterior surfaces of the ex-occipitals. This occipital condyles articulates with the convexities of the first vertebral column called atlas, that brings about the movement of the skull in frog. The ex-occipital firmly get fused with auditory capsule on its outer sides, forming a wing-like projections, and it encloses a minute opening called fenestra ovalis. This is the wing-like projections that encloses a minute opening called as the fenestra ovalis, which leads to the auditory capsule on either side. This is the auditory capsule, which is led by the minute opening called as fenestra ovalis. And the anterior wall, that is the roof and the floor of auditory capsule, is formed by an irregular cartilage bone called the prutic. This is the prutic bone, which actually forms the entire roof and floor of the auditory capsule. Auditory capsule actually encloses the organs of hearing. And this auditory capsule, where the roof and floor is formed by the irregular cartilage bone called the prutic bone, and is partially covered on its outer dorsal surface by the squamosal. So in front, that is at the anterior side of the prutic bone, is actually bit covered by the part of a squamosal bone. This is the squamosal bone. Hope you understood this occipital segment of the cranium. Here I'll just repeat. Occipital segment is the posterior most part of the cranium, where it encloses a large hole called foramen magnum, from which the spinal cord emerges out from the cranium. In the occipital segment, there are two irregular cartilaginous bones called exoccipitals, which lie on each side of the foramen, and it completely surrounds the foramen. The exoccipital bears a oval convexities on their posterior surfaces, which are called as occipital condyles, which actually articulates with the convexities of the first vertebral column called atlas. This brings about the movement of the head in the frog, and because of the presence of two occipital condyles in the skull, the frog of skull is known as dicondylic skull. The exoccipital firmly get fused with the auditory capsule on its outer sides, and this forms the wing-like projections, and it also encloses a minute opening called the fenestra ovalis, which leads to auditory capsule on each side. The anterior wall, the roof and the floor of auditory capsule is formed by an irregular cartilage bone called the prutic bone, and is partially covered on its outer dorsal surface by the squamosal bone. Coming to the ethmoid bone. This could be observed in the skull. This is the ethmoid bone, which actually present at the anterior end of the cranium. Here you can have a look at the loose bone of the ethmoid bone. It is tubular bone, and it encircles the anterior end of the cranial cavity, and it forms the posterior wall of nasal cavity. You can see the bone, which is tubular in structure. When you observe carefully, you can see that this tubular bone is transversely divided, resulting in anterior ethmoidal portion. This is the ethmoidal portion, and posteriorly the sphenoidal portion. And these two portions are found fused. Hence, it is called as ethmoidal region. The posterior portion of the ethmoidal segment actually encircles and encloses the forebrain in the cranium. The anterior portion of the ethmoid segment is called as the ethmoidal portion, which is further divided longitudinally. It is divided longitudinally, and results into the right and left portions of the ethmoidal portion, which actually encloses the olfactory sacs. The spine ethmoid bone is anteriorly, that means dorsally, overlapped by the nasal bones and the frontoparietal bones, and ventrally by the parasphenoid bones. Here you can see that the spine ethmoidal segment, which consists of the two portions, that is the ethmoidal portion and the sphenoidal portion, the entire segment is overlapped by the nasal bones anteriorly and posteriorly by the frontoparietal bone. As you can see that there is a small portion is only seen on the dorsal side, which is in the diamond shaped. This is the spine ethmoid bone, which is actually seen from the dorsal surface of the skull, where it is completely overlapped by the anteriorly by nasal bones and posteriorly by the frontoparietal bones. Hope I have cleared the structure of spine ethmoid bone gulls. Coming to the frontoparietals, these bones could be seen in the entire skull of the frog on the dorsal side. Here, this is the frontoparietal segment of the skull, which is present at mid-dorsal region of the skull. The in detail structure of the frontoparietals could be studied by looking at the diagram C. This frontoparietals are the pair of long, broad, flattened and membranous bones. They are united along the mid-dorsal line and form a single bone, and it forms the whole roof of the cranium. As you can see here, in the diagram, this is the frontoparietal bones, which is actually a paired bones which are fused together to form a frontoparietals, means anteriorly the parietal bones and the frontal bones are fused to form a frontoparietals. These are long, broad, flattened and membranous bones which are united at mid-dorsal line, and this frontoparietal bones actually forms the whole roof of the cranium. So, in the single bone, you can see the structure of the frontoparietal bones here. In larval stages of frog, where the bones, that is the frontal bones and the parietal bones, are completely separated, where in the adult stage, As it develops, these two bones are completely fused to form a single bone called as frontoparietal bones. These frontoparietals, they extend in front, overlapping the spine ethmoid and behind up to the occipital bones. Here you can see the frontoparietals, they are extending towards the anterior side, overlapping the spine ethmoid bone, and it also extends posteriorly where it overlaps the x-occipitals. And anteriorly it articulates with the nasal bones. It articulates with the nasal bones, while posteriorly with the protic bones and the occipital and the occipitals. Coming to the parasphenoid bone of the skull. This parasphenoid bone is actually present on the ventral side of the skull. Here you can see the parasphenoid segment of the skull, which is actually present on the ventral side of the skull. It is a large dagger shaped bone, forms the entire floor of the cranium. As you can see that the dagger shape, and it consists of a blade or a shaft or a pointed long arm of the dagger, which is directed anteriorly below the spine ethmoid bone. Here the spine ethmoid bone on dorsal side you can see, just exactly behind the spine ethmoid bone you find the parasphenoid bone, and this parasphenoid bone, which is present on the ventral side of the skull just below the spine ethmoid and forms the entire floor of the cranium. The handles of this dagger shaped structure, it extends across the auditory capsules. Here you can see the dagger shaped structure having an handles on either side that actually extends up to the auditory capsules. Here you can have a look at the loose bone structure, that is the diagram D shows the shape of the parasphenoid, that is the dagger shaped, forming the entire floor of the cranium. It is found directly below the spine ethmoid bone, and the handles of this dagger shape, it is extends across the auditory capsules. Coming to the other part of the skull is the sense capsules. It is called so because the skull encloses the pair of auditory capsules, pair of olfactory capsules, and a pair of optic capsules. Together they are called as the sense capsules of the skull. The auditory capsules, as I told you and shown in the skull, that these auditory capsules, here you can see the position of the auditory capsules just exactly present at the posterior part of the cranium near the ex-occipital region. The auditory capsules are present, and these auditory capsules actually encloses the organ of hearing and a pair of the pair of auditory, the organs of hearing. Coming to the olfactory capsules. The olfactory capsules are cartilaginous in nature. It encloses the organs of smell, and these are firmly fused with the cranium, and they are mainly made up of cartilage, and that is why they are cartilaginous in nature. The optic capsules, it encloses a large eyes, and these are not found fused with the skull. The nasal bones, these are the nasal bones. In the skull diagram, you can make out the nasal bones which are present at the anterior end of the skull. These are the pair of large, flat and triangular membranous bones which are present at anterior dorsal region of the skull. These nasal bones forms the roof of the olfactory capsules, and they are joined at mid-dorsal line. This is the nasal bones which are found at the mid-dorsal, joined at the mid-dorsal line. The nasal bones actually extend anteriorly and reach up to the premaxilla of the upper jaw and partly form the boundary of the external nares. And the outer process meet the, this is the outer portion of the nasal which meets the maxilla of the upper jaw. Coming to the Septo Maxillaries. This can be seen in the skull of frog on dorsal weave, and that is on the dorsal side. The Septo Maxillaris bones are found extreme tip of the skull, that is at the anterior end of the skull, possess a pair of Septo Maxillaris. These are minute, irregularly shaped bones and has a broad basal plate and a backwardly directed limbs. And these Septo Maxillaris are very close to the anterior portion of each nasal bone. Here you can see that this Septum Maxillaries, which are very close to the anterior tip of the nasal bones. This can be observed in the loose bones. The shape of the septum maxillaris, which are small, irregularly shaped, present at the anterior tip of the skull, very close to the tip of the anterior tip of the nasal bones. And these septum maxillaris, which are pair and has got the broad basal plate and a backwardly directed limb, which actually touches the anterior end of the nasal bones. Coming to the omers. For this, you have to have a look at the dorsal view of the skull, the ventral view of the skull, where you can find the omer bones at the anterior end of the skull. This is the region where a pair of the omer bones are situated in the ventral side of the skull. These are also a pair of a small flat triangular bones present on ventral side of the skull, and it forms the floor of the olfactory capsules. Since the anterior end of the skull bears the olfactory capsules, and this omer bones actually forms the floor of the olfactory capsules, and it also forms the inner margins of the nostrils, and the posterior lateral edge of each bone bears a pointed omerine teeth. So this is the omerine teeth. Here in this diagram, you can have a look at the shape and size of the omer bones, which is small, flat and triangular, which is forming the floor of the olfactory capsules, and it also bears the omerine tooth, and also it forms a margins for the nostrils. The third part of the skull is called as the visceral skeleton, which actually includes the upper and lower jaws. The upper jaw of the skull, in case of frog, the upper jaw is completely fused with the skull and it is immovable. This upper jaw is also called as the maxillary arch. It consists of the anterior most part called the premaxilla. For this, you can have a look at the picture of the dorsal view of the skull. Here you can see the structure of the upper jaw on the outer rim of the skull is actually the upper jaw, which is found fused with the skull, and it consists of the premaxilla. This is the premaxilla. It is a small irregular bone in the anterior tip of the snout, meeting in the middle line. The upper jaw, where it is exactly divided into two equal halves. Each half will have these similar parts, and the first one is the premaxilla. The premaxilla from each side, they are united in the middle line, and each premaxilla bears few conical teeth in two rows along its anterior lower edge. This could be observed in the ventral view of the skull, where this is the teeth which are present the entire length of the upper jaw, and in the premaxilla also. Each premaxilla articulates behind with a maxilla which forms the greater portion of the upper jaw. This premaxilla articulates with the maxilla which actually forms the greater part of the upper jaw. It is long, thin and slightly curved with backwardly directed conical teeth. That is the maxilla. The maxilla is the second part of the upper jaw, is connected behind with quadratojugal at its middle of its length. So this is the quadratojugal. The maxilla is getting connected with the quadratojugal backwardly and articulates with the palatine and anterior limb of the pterygoid. This maxilla is backwardly, that is at the posterior side, it gets connected with the quadratojugal on dorsal side, and it also gets connected with the pterygoid bone. So here this is the pterygoid bone, and it also articulates with the palatine bones. So this is the palatine bone and the pterygoid bone, and ventral side get connected with the maxilla. The quadratojugal, the third part of the upper jaw, is called as the quadratojugals. These are a small, slender bones with a characteristic comma-like structure, that is the shape. When you observe the quadratojugal, the bone resembles the comma shape. It forms the posterior part of the upper jaw, and its posterior broad end unites with the quadrate cartilage. The quadratojugal is actually a small bone, comma-shaped bone, and it has got the posterior broad portion. It will get articulated with the quadrate cartilage at the tip. The last part of the upper jaw is called as the quadrate cartilage. It is a thin rod-like, and it forms the suspensorium at each angle of the mouth by connecting skull with the mandible. It brings about the movement of the lower jaw. It also fused with the auditory capsules. Coming to the squamosals, these are T-shaped or hammer-shaped bones attached dorsolaterally to the posterior end of cranium above the pterygoids. So for which you have to look at the ventral side of the skull. Here, the dorsal side of the skull. Here you can find the squamosal bones, which is actually the T-shaped bone which is present on dorsal side of the skull, and it is present on the dorsal side of the cranium above the pterygoids. So the pterygoid bone which is present on the ventral side. Just above the pterygoid you find the T-shaped or hammer-shaped bones called the squamosals. And these squamosal bones helps to support the annular tympanic bone, where the one end of its hammer-shaped part attaches to the auditory capsule. So when I say this is the T-shaped squamosal, one end is attaching to the auditory capsule and the protic bone. The handle of T-shape articulates with the quadrate cartilage. The handle of the hammer shape, that is articulating with the quadrate cartilage, and it also forms the posterior dorsal margin of the eye orbit on its side. And here you can see that this also is touching the margins of the orbit. This is the orbit which is touched by the one end of the squamosal bone. Coming to the pterygoids, these are present at ventral side of the skull. Just have a look at the ventral side of the skull. This is the pterygoid bone on the ventral side. It is present, as I have told you, that just behind the squamosal bones and attached laterally to posterior end of the cranium. On the lateral side, it is attached to the cranium of the skull. Each pterygoid is a large Y-shaped bone. Each pterygoid is large and Y-shaped bone having the three rays are the limbs. As you can see in the diagram, the shape of the pterygoid, it is Y shape having the three rays and the limbs, where its anterior ray or the limb joins with maxilla. So this is its anterior limb. It is actually attaching to the maxilla and outer end of the palatine, and it also attaches to the palatine. Whereas its inner ray or the limb joins with parasphenoid and auditory capsule. So the inner ray is this, which is attaching to the parasphenoid. So the parasphenoid is here, the other limb is this. This is connecting to the parasphenoid and also connecting to the auditory capsules. This is the auditory capsule which is connected by the part of the pterygoid bone, and its posterior ray articulates with the quadratojugal and quadrate cartilage. So this is the posterior limb This is the posterior limb which is attaching to the quadratojugal as well as the quadrate cartilage. The pterygoid also contributes to the posterior ventral margins of the eye orbits on its side. The pterygoid bone is also contributing to form the margins of the eye orbit on this side. Coming to the palatine bones. For this also you have to look at the ventral view of the skull. These are elongated. The palatine bones are these. The palatine bones are these, where they are elongated, slender, delicate and rod-like bones, and they are bounded transversely on ventral anterior side of each orbit. Here you can see the palatine bones, which are elongated, slender, delicate and rod-like bones, forming the boundary of the eye orbit on each side. That is a transverse boundary on each side of the eye orbit. They also connected to the anterior side of cranium with the middle of maxilla. This palatine bones is also get connected to the upper jaw part called the maxilla. Coming to these are the bones of upper jaw, that is the loose bones of the upper jaw: premaxilla, maxilla, quadratojugal, squamosal, and also you find the pterygoid bone in this picture. Coming to the other part of the skull is the lower jaw or the mandible. It is a semicircular bone, or it has got the semicircular shape. It is composed of the two halves, like that of upper jaw. The lower jaw also consists of the two halves, and these two halves are called as rami, and single is called as ramus. These two rami are united anteriorly by a ligament which is called as Meckel cartilage. In frog, the lower jaw is completely devoid of teeth, means the lower jaw doesn't possess any kind of teeth. Teeth are completely absent. Each half or the ramus of the lower jaw consists of a core of Meckel's cartilage, which are surrounded by the three bones. They are the mentomecillin, the angulospinial, and the dentary. These are the three bones of the lower jaw. The mentomecillin, it is a small cartilage bone present at extreme anterior end of Meckel's cartilage, and it unites, that is, it symphyses the two halves of the mandible or the lower jaw. The mentomacillian bone is small cartilage bone, and this unites the two pieces of the lower jaw. It brings about the symphysis. The other bone is called as angulospinial bone. It is a long and curved bone which forms the main inner and anterior portion of each ramus or the half of the mandible, halves of the mandible. So here you can see that this is the angulospinial bone, which is actually forms the major part of the lower jaw. It is long and it is curved. The anterior end is tapering. This is the anterior end. It is tapering, and its posterior end bears a dorsally surfaced, the condyle or a knob-like articular surface. So this is the posterior end of the angulospinial bone, which has got a knob-like articular surface for the articulation with the quadrate cartilage of the skull, that is the part of the upper jaw, where it brings about the articulation of the skull with the lower jaw. And just to its upper side, it produces into a small coronary process. This is the coronary process. You can have a look at the shape, the structure of the bones of the lower jaw. The mentomacillian bone and the angulospinial bone. The third bone of the lower jaw is called as the dentary bone. This is the dentary bone. It is a small, flat, dagger-like bone. Covers the outer surface of the Meckel's cartilage. So this is a small, flat, dagger-shaped bone which is actually covering the outer surface of the Meckel's cartilage at the anterior tip of the lower jaw, and it extends anteriorly up to mentomacillian bone and posteriorly up to the angulospinial bone. And this is the dentary bone of the lower jaw. Hope you could understand the parts, that is the bones of the lower jaw and its articulation with the skull. Students, in this session, I hope you would have developed the knowledge of identifying the bones of skull and bones of lower jaw, as well as the arrangement of bones and their articulation, and also the skill of drawing and labeling the bones of skull and lower jaw. Students, let us take up few questions and answer them to recall the concept, that is today's concept, how best you could able to understand, and also to evaluate ourselves. Here the first question. Cranium in frog is formed by, is it by the spine ethmoid bone, the frontoparietal bones, the parasphenoid bones, and all of these frame the cranium? Yes, the answer is D. All the three bones forms the crane of the skull in frog. The second question. Auditory capsules in frog are formed by, is it by a protic bone or a tympanic bone forms the auditory capsules, or both the protic bone and a tympanic bone frames the auditory capsule, or none of these bones forms the auditory capsule? The answer is yes, A, that is the only protic bone frames the auditory capsules in frog. The third question is, which of these is a paired bone in frog? Is this the Septo Maxillary parasphenoid, the spine ethmoid, and none of these? The answer is A. Yes, Septo Maxillaries are a paired bones in frog. The fourth question is, in an autostylic jaw suspension, the lower jaw is suspended at the quadrate, at the squamosal, at the jugular, or none of these? The answer is yes, at the quadrate. It makes the auto suspension of the lower jaw. The fifth question. The Y-shaped bone in the skull of frog is called the spine ethmoid bone, palatine bone, quadratojugal, or the pterygoid? The answer is yes, the pterygoid bone on the ventral side of the skull is Y-shaped bone. These are the references from which you can draw some more information. The website address as well as the books could be referred. Thank you.